Hi, everyone. Welcome to Music Talk from McNally. We're here at McNally Robinson. I'm Mark Turner, and I get to have Eric back with me. Hello, Eric.
Hello, Mark. It's nice to be back.
It has been a few months since we last sat in these chairs to get to visit. You've been busy. We've been busy. How's life?
Life is pretty good. It's it's things are rolling along, but it's really nice to be back here in Saskatoon.
Yeah, and warm. That's
Very compared to what I was seeing 2 weeks ago.
2 weeks ago, we had the lovely Leslie Dalla here to conduct our Valentine's concert, and Les noted to me that the last time he was in Saskatoon, it was a heat wave. And I pointed out that this was not.
Right, he's getting the extremes.
Yeah. And I also had to point out to him it's not like this all the time. No, his Vancouver weather attitude was a bit hurt in our cold. So
yeah,
and we had to install extra heaters into St. John's to be able to keep the musicians performing. So that was a trick. We don't have to do that this week.
No, hopefully not.
So it's a real thrill to be back here at McNally Robinson. We're so grateful to the folks here at McNally who accommodate us so that we can do this live stream from here. Huge thanks to all the staff and especially to Rachel who helps us out. So this weekend, this will be your fourth live stream with us this year, and you did 3 bang 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 right off the top. We've come a long ways in terms of technology. We have so many more tools and trinkets, and those of us behind the cameras actually know what we're doing now. So that's also a lot of fun. Are you excited to be back at the craft of it?
Oh, I am for sure. There's a number of levels of it. There's the excitement, of course, working live with musicians in an orchestral setting, but also to get back into the hustle and bustle of what we all started in fall, right? And I've been watching the live streams, of course, over the last number of months, but it's I can't wait to have Simeon and you and everyone and Daryl all there and to see how it goes and what the changes have been.
And thankfully, this weekend is actually a fairly straight ahead program for us, which is always a relief on our end. I can say that on behalf of everyone behind the cameras. This week is the Carnival of Venice. We are doing this whole year of musical travel. I remember the first day we talked about it back in like June, and it was like, yeah, great, perfect. And Venice was like Carnival of Venice was one of the first things we laid down because we're like, easy, great,
exactly.
Perfect. And it really is an easy subject to do music on.
It is. I just about laughed when you said back in June. Like, that's crazy to think how we programmed a whole season, with only a few months before we started.
I want to point out that the crazy thing is that actually this concert hasn't changed from what we originally
programmed.
That is
true.
Which is actually because everything else has changed.
All the time.
Sometimes like days ahead of the
right.
show.
Yeah.
So knock on wood that nothing actually
hopefully not in the next 4 days. But you're right. There's this one was a kind of a no-brainer. February, Carnival, the excitement of a festival before Lent, all of that really lent itself well to what we're doing. And the Venetians, the Baroque Venetians, were fantastic at music. One of the most famous being Vivaldi, and you go from there.
Have you been to Venice?
I have, yeah.
Okay, so I have also been to Venice. In talking to people about Venice, my go-to word is it's one of the strangest places I've ever been.
It's strange because, and there's so much.
It's just so much,
and
it's
what,
so close.
And what we have in our minds is so much. Everyone talks about Venice all the time. So when you go, you have this thing in your mind. And I don't know about you, but some things matched it and some things did not.
It was people had warned me about the tourists. And I arrived in Venice kind of late in the day, and I had time to barely eat and rush off to Fenice for an opera. And then I got lost on my way coming home because I didn't know Venice. And Google Maps is of no use to you in Venice, I promise you. It's not going to happen. And so I got lost in the rain coming home from the opera. Got home. The next day, got up, went downstairs, and the concierge at the desk said to me, just so you know, there's 4 cruise ships in port, so that's an additional 150,000 people.
Yeah.
Which I didn't have a concept for, and you don't until you step into those crowds. And then also, like you say, it is what you expect, but it's not.
No, and it's sensory overload in a wonderful way, and but you have to take breaks or just kind of lay low for a bit and then come back out, and that's what I love about this program and those composers of that time, and you know how, in Carnival we see the Venetian masks, and those are always, they look, I haven't been to a party where I've worn a mask the whole time. Well, Halloween, people are kind of hiding, but they're there for a really, really good time.
Well, and what I find fascinating, I mean, when you think about the height of Carnival, which was the 1700s, which was when all these pieces were composed, I mean, Carnival was like, it was Vegas.
Big time.
What happened at Carnival in Venice
and
stayed at Carnival in Venice.
That's why they shut it down.
Knew who you were.
That's why they shut it down for 200 years. Yeah. And it only came back in the 1970s.
Yeah, 70s. Yeah.
Yeah, which because exactly that. It was like debauchery.
Yeah.
Well,
and when you think, I mean, I got to go see, while I was there, I actually, my hotel was very close to one of the old prisons of the Doge, and I got to go see the cell that Casanova was held in. That the Venice of those the height days of Carnival with Casanova and all of these people out on their grand tour, parties every day of the week. During certain times in that 1700s, it was the only time like the opera's houses were open. Like it's a fascinating thing to think about, and you can hear it and feel it in the energy of the music.
It's so much so the music. When we talk about Baroque music, and we know Bach, we know Handel, or the general audience does, and it's even Vivaldi, it's very accessible, the Four Seasons, of course. But because we've heard it so much, we sometimes forget how adventurous it is. And so things will be going this way harmonically, the orchestra will set it up, and then all of a sudden the soloist goes this way. But it also is in the structure and the timing. He does this all the time. Vivaldi always displaces the phrase 2 beats later in every concerto. And so it's a bit off-putting, but it's still exciting. And even the slow movements, there's a beauty to them, but there's unexpected turns.
Yeah, and like you say, those unexpected turns and those moments of the harmonies and the chord progressions that Vivaldi would give us that must have sounded so strange in those rooms. I mean, being in some of those rooms, I mean, they're just big, empty, hollow. The acoustic must have been haunting in some of those minor things.
That's right, and he could take those risks because of his job. He was a priest, but he actually never practiced the mass. Apparently because of his lung issues, but
he had terrible asthma. And speaking on behalf of asthmatics in Venice, it's not great actually. There's a lot of humidity in that floating town.
Yeah, and so he was, the director of the orphanage for girls, and he brought the level of that orphanage. There were 4 in Venice at the time, but he brought them up to such a state of excellence that royalty from around Europe would come hear it and hear this unexpectedness. And at the beginning, when he first got the job, the board had to vote every single year to keep him on. So he did not have a long contract. We'll talk about like job insecurity. Yeah. But he finally, gained the trust of them so that he could do it year after year. But he had the ability to train these girls to an exceptional level and then throw stuff at them that they just relished in and did an exceptional job.
Yeah, because they were all young girls. I mean, these are preteens and teenagers. We think of these concertis being written for professional musicians, but they weren't.
No.
And based on the difficulty of the concertos, they must have been exceptional.
Incredible musicians. And the orphanage at the time, if you were a boy, you learned a trade and then you're out at 15. But the girls didn't have that limit. So yeah, they're exceptional already at 13 and 14, but they could even still learn their craft even a bit more into their early 20s.
Yeah. We do 3 pieces by Vivaldi this weekend. He wrote like 400 and some concerti. The piece that I'm excited about all 3. I was going to say I'm most excited about, but I'm excited about all 3. The one that I'm looking forward to hearing, because you don't hear it often, is his Concerto Grosso that we're doing. We don't. Handel, sure, wrote a ton of Concerti Grossi. Bach wrote, he has, but you don't think of it with Vivaldi as much.
No, you said the word concerto, and with concertos you almost always think solo instrument. That's the basic concerto. And so with Bach you've got the violin concerti, the piano concerti, of course, and Handel the same thing. Whereas Vivaldi, of course, he wrote the Four Seasons and the L'Astro a Monaco and all the concertos, but the concertos for string orchestra alone with harpsichord are exceptional, and he wrote many of them. And it's a chance to make the orchestra shine, because they have these pyrotechnics that the soloist will often have, but as a whole. So it's a really full sound coming at you with these soloistic twists and turns in there.
Yeah. It's music you don't get to hear very often.
No.
Actually, all of the Vivaldi are music you don't get to hear very often. I find it intriguing that he wrote the 6 flute concerti. We're doing F major.
That's right.
Okay, good.
Yeah, 4-3-4.
With our very own principal, Alison Miller. We're very excited to have Alison up front this week. And his asthma made it so he couldn't play a wind instrument. Mm-hmm. So, you think of some of these composers, particularly at that time, they played everything. They could pick up an instrument and play it to an amazing standard. Vivaldi couldn't play the flute.
No.
So is it is it like a violin concerto but on a flute, or is it idiomatic to the flute?
It is idiomatic to the flute. Yeah, and it's interesting because great thing that what you mentioned, because of course the bassoon concerti, he wrote the most bassoon concerti of ever composer, and he didn't play the bassoon, and I mean, bassoon is even stranger than flute.
It's harder than flute, frankly.
And they're incredible, well suited for the bassoon. And so the of course it wasn't what we normally have today as the flute. It was the traverse and other certain elements or different types of flutes. But it's idiomatic, and it's a chance. All flute players love them because it's a chance for them to shine. Of course, they can shine in some of the bigger concertos, but there aren't that many bigger concertos, or even later on. Yeah. And so this is a chance for them to really shine.
Yeah, and they're not easy. No. They're incredibly difficult. Presumably, there must have been a student at the Ospedale who was able to do it. What can people expect from Alison playing this concerto with us? I mean, she has such a wonderful, clear, bright sound. Mm-hmm. I think this is so well suited for her sound. It's a little fun piece.
It is, and as you and I know, and all of us at the orchestra, Alison is very detailed and just has so many wonderful ideas. And I've loved, talking over with her for a couple of times already, and we have a rehearsal in a couple of days, just us alone. And I love how she gets excited about the certain details and the phrasing here, and what about this? Should we use this articulation? And she's always very gentle. But of course, it's up to you, Maestro. And I'm like, no, it's your concerto. It's your concerto. And so that's really exciting. When a soloist, I mean, all soloists are very excited about their concerti, and I love her enthusiasm for that.
Yeah, and it must be a thrill to get to play it because they're not done very often. Yeah. The third Vivaldi piece, which you're going to have to remember the name of because I never can. We're joined by soprano Chelsea Mehan.
That's right, In Furore.
Thank you, In Furore, which is also, frankly, I hadn't heard it actually until Chelsea has suggested it. Mm-hmm. And I'm a fan of Vivaldi's vocal music. Right. There's a ton of it. He wrote just like a gaggle of, that's not it, a gaggle of vocal music, 40 operas plus all of this other stuff. Mm-hmm. We don't get to hear it very often. No. And his vocal music is challenging in a different way than, say, Handel. Mm-hmm. Different type of fireworks.
Different type of fireworks, and this is where these twists and turns come in harmonically, because things here and there, I mean, it's denser and different in certain ways, but Vivaldi, for the singer, you've got to know your stuff, because you're going a long line. Let's say the second aria, the third movement. You're going long, and it's phrased 4 bars. But then also the first 16-32 bars are normal, and then all of a sudden you've got to make these changes, and the singer has to be in there as to really grasp the overall arc of it, and then with the repeats, of course, with the ornamentation, but. There's a certain sensibility that is different than Bach or Handel or any other Baroque composer.
Yeah, and it's funny you'd say that. You're right. It is that arc that the vocalist creates over top of these harmonies that are often a bit alien to vocal music at that time, mm-hmm. because he could. Yeah. And he wrote so much of it actually for Carnival. Like, so many of his works were premiered in those 2.5 months.
Exactly, and. It's funny. I actually years ago I took this on tour. I was a violist with Les Violons. We took it on tour with great Canadian soprano.
Karina Gauvin.
Thank you, Karina Gauvin. And I remember the viola part is not that hard. So I had this thing of just kind of memorizing so I could look at the audience. And I would look at the audience, and these twists would turn. Of course, Karina's a fantastic singer. And you could see in some of the eyes going, whoa, here we go. What's going on? And that's what's surprising. This is, audiences that know classical music is just a perfect example of the depth that Vivaldi can go. And then the fireworks in the fourth movement. Just a quick bam, here we go. Let's show off what a soprano can do.
His music is so Venetian. It sounds like Venice looks, with the ornate palazzos and then the expensive piazzas, and it has a sense of strangeness about it. And Venice is it's strangely beautiful. It is not what you would classify, but it is in its own oddities.
Yeah, and that's what we were talking about, where it's kind of sensory overload, and it's kind of gorgeous, and you're like, what? Oh, it's gorgeous. Oh, what? And it's back and forth.
Yeah. Fascinating about Vivaldi, I mean, most of his music was forgotten after he died. It wasn't really until almost 100 years ago that his music came out of the stacks of history.
Exactly, and you notice that more and more with certain with almost all composers, they need champions. They need champions. It was like 1913, 1914 when Vivaldi started coming back, and you think that's insane because the Four Seasons is one of the most well-known classical pieces. And same with Bach. His was, dying away. He was not the cool kid at all at the end. Handel, they had to be revived and have champions. And Vivaldi is the same way. His fame was going down so much that the emperor who liked him in Vienna said, come up here. Don't worry, we've got a whole thing for you. You're going to get an annual salary until you die. You're all good. So he's like, finally, I can keep some of the money that I have. Went up there. Before he got there, the emperor died. And he died very, very poor in Vienna, not even in Venice.
And he's buried in Vienna.
Yeah.
He's not even in Venice. It's when you go to the stunning floating cemetery, and you think that's the one you're going to find. No. Yeah. So he had that too often told tale of composers dying poor, but his music, so glad it was revived. Yeah, and still to this day gets played more and more. I remember for a while there in the 90s, early 2000s when new pieces of his were discovered so frequently, particularly the vocal music. That had been, as they were starting to restore some of the old opera houses, and then we're finding like, oh, he wrote another opera that we just found. That was a neat time in history. So it's great that we get to live that now and have all that music. It wasn't just Vivaldi though. Venice at that in that Baroque area, those 1700s. I mean, what a hit making city, and maybe more so as a city location than anyone else at that time in history, because you had, I guess it was sort of the crossroads of the world.
Exactly. It was, Venice had been like during the whole when salt was the major resource for 1,000 years, which is hard to think about today. Yeah. It was the silver or the gold of their time. And they laid into that and built their wealth. And so when the Baroque era came, of course, salt was on the downfall by then. But it was the hotbed of all of these musicians and this creativity, so much so that Handel went down to Venice to check it out. Bach didn't go down, but he was very much
their music very seriously.
Very, very seriously. He was greatly influenced by Vivaldi and other Baroque Italian composers. In London, of course, Handel had an Italian opera company. All this, it was based on the Italian and to a large part the Venetian style of music at that time.
And their music was the Venetian music was so inspired by all those the collection of cultural voices there. You hear the rhythm and the ornateness from the Middle East, from Northern Africa, that music that showed up in town and became part of the scene.
Exactly. And the one composer that there's a lot of, you talked about the other influences around, Isabella Leonarda. She's a bit earlier in the Baroque time before Vivaldi, And she worked a little bit in isolation in terms of where she was, and she was also a nun. But you can hear that influence. You can hear that pushing the boundaries of harmony, because she was pushing it. Vivaldi and afterwards were kind of settling in, even though they had the twists and turns. Leonardo was still pushing those boundaries and also trying different things out, because first of all, she could within her setting, but also she was a woman that did not get that many chances as opposed to her male counterparts. So she let loose in terms of her creativity of what she could do.
And we opened the concert this weekend with a piece of hers. I'm really excited about it. I'm certain it's the first time it's been played in Saskatchewan.
Probably maybe first time
in Canada.
Who knows?
It's hard to say. Her music is not done very often, so I'm really excited about this. Tell us a little bit about this sonata.
Mm-hmm. So Leonardo mostly wrote for voice. That was a way that women composers had a kind of a foot in the door back then, because they did use women voices at times, so they could compose for themselves here and there, but they could also be part of a royal family. And for her, she wrote mostly vocal music, but a little bit of instrumental. And we discussed this before, where not hardly any Baroque woman composer wrote instrumental music. It was almost all vocal.
Yeah, we have been looking for a piece by Barbara Strozzi, who is one of the great Venetian composers. If you don't know anything about Barbara Strozzi, go look her up. Her music is incredible. She was self-published. She wrote her own lyrics. Genius. Isabel Leonardo actually wrote something without a singing line.
That's right. And there's a collection of 12 of them, and they're for trio, 2 violins, cello, and continuo. And we've just expanded it to the orchestra. I was going to say full orchestra. Still a Baroque orchestra, which is quite small, but
as full as distancing will allow.
That's right. That's right. And these works, what's unique about them is that they're, at that time, an orchestral work was usually 3 or 4 movements. Well, sometimes they're up to 12 movements, these sonatas. They're quite short, and there's a lot of intricacies to them, and they often run one movement into the other. But what I love about it, and what I loved about getting to know it, because I would choose from a number of different sonatas, and I chose this one because of how it starts, first of all. And there is some things that people are like, oh, okay, that will make sense, and other really interesting twists and turns more than Vivaldi, which I love to start the program that way.
She was very adventurous.
Yes.
Yeah, really fascinating.
Yeah,
and it actually is a great way to step into the world of Vivaldi, because he was reacting to the world that had been created for him by Leonardo and Strozzi and those early voices that were slightly off the beaten path.
That's right. And this is, I talked about championing these composers. We talk about Vivaldi and Bach and Handel needing champions, like Mendelssohn, like the researchers and musicologists of the 20th century. Women composers never had that. No. They don't, and because of the situation. But more and more, hopefully, it's coming more and more where people are discovering them. And early music groups like Tafel Music and all these groups, they dive into that music because they don't want to just play Bach or Vivaldi or Handel. And so there's a lot of things going on in that world, and you see smaller ensembles take on this music. And why not? Yeah. It's fantastic music that people should hear, and it's a delight to discover it, because it is really nice to hear our Vivaldis and our Bachs and our Beethovens and Mozart. Wonderful, wonderful music. But when you hear something new of a similar...
In Venice, it was particularly horrid, actually, because this has plagued the classical music industry for centuries with the way we've treated the not only the work but the legacy of these female composers. In Venice, it was they scandalized the women so that their music wasn't legitimate, and that I find that so fascinating in a city that was so full of scandal.
Exactly.
that it actually made an impact and did actually sort of silence them in a way. So it's a thrill to have it on the program this weekend to open the show with it. I'm really excited about that. We have the music of Giuseppe Tartini, who he gave us the Devil's Trill.
Mm-hmm. He was a composer mostly of violin music, or what we know today as violin music, and one of those composers that was following along. Well, it wasn't that long at that point, but a history of violin technique. So now violins get up and they play the Tchaikovsky concerto, the Ligeti, or whatever it is, and it's crazy, and they can just do it. Well, they have to practice.
But show up and do it.
But that all developed from these composers, Corelli before him, and Locatelli, and these other mostly Italian composers, and before and Vivaldi, and then we have Tartini. And Tartini, he yes, Devil's Trill is probably his most famous one, but there's also a lot of violin concertos, and the work that we're presenting is actually the trumpet concerto, but was originally a violin concerto.
Right.
Yeah,
it's yeah, and thankfully it's sort of been championed by trumpeters in the last few years, because you don't hear a lot of his violin concertos.
No, not at all.
I've never heard this played by a violin, but by trumpet all the time.
That's right.
And it lends itself brilliantly. A slightly different key, but it does lend itself brilliantly to the trumpet. And I'm so thrilled to have Dean McNeil back with us this weekend. We've got a wonderful video actually on our website. If you go to saskatoonsymphony.org and to SSO for You, there's a phenomenal video that Dean shared with us of actually exploring how to play this concerto, which is really exciting. What is it like? What is Tartini's music like compared to? I would like to say it's not as intelligent as Vivaldi. That sounds mean, but
I would say it's already in a more established Baroque period. So we have
that's so much nicer than what I just said.
So we have the adventurousness of Vivaldi and others coming up, and then we not settled into something, but it seems that way. Yeah. Where Tartini, what you hear, you're going to go, oh, that makes sense.
He wrote hits.
He wrote hits.
Yeah,
he wrote hits. Yeah. It's brilliant in terms of the showmanship, and there's a slow, fast movement, and it's very beautiful. But the last movement is a rondo. Rondo means the main theme comes back a number of times, so that's very clear. The first one is it's almost getting into classical in terms of the era where you've got your way. And you mentioned Dean's video where at first he plays the piccolo trumpet, which wasn't invented by then, and then he has the natural trumpet, and the natural trumpet could not do what the violin did back then, and so he's using if they want to use it there, and so it brings out that brilliance and that hit making quality of Tartini.
Exactly, and a piccolo trumpet is quite literally what you'd assume it is. It's like a piccolo of a flute. It's small. Someone asked me that one day, and I was like, "It's just a small one." And it has a much more brilliant, easier to hit those higher notes. Yes. Supposedly, I supposedly played the trumpet at one point in my life. I tried to play the piccolo trumpet. No, at no point is that easier. It is not easier to hit those high notes. The second movement in it, I think, is borderline genius. It is really beautiful writing. We talk a lot about the fact that like Beethoven made second movements a religious experience. I think the Venetian Baroque artists figured that out, and Beethoven just ripped them off on it, because this is deeply moving, romantic music.
Gorgeous music. And you talked about the hit making. We talked about Venice being this city of spectacles and city of it's funny because as I said that, I saw the Las Vegas book over there. That Las Vegas where there's everything there, right? And which includes hard on sleeve romanticism, and not the era, of course, that came in the 1800s, but that feeling.
Some of them probably actually wore hearts on their sleeve because it was Carnival.
That's right, and that second movement is one of those movements where you kind of just sit back and go, oh my goodness, and just let it wash over you. So that there's nothing to figure out. There's nothing to analyze, or it's just beautiful music that plays itself.
Yeah, and to go from that beautiful second movement to one of the most important second movements ever written, in the beautiful oboe concerto that is definitely by a Marcello. We're just not entirely sure which one.
Alessandro Benedetto, yeah. But the second movement you talk about is probably the movement that the general public might go, hold on, I've heard that on some radio station or something. It's one of those gorgeous Baroque movements that Bach loved so much that he used and made it into a keyboard work, and and added a lot of flourishes. And this is where you're joking about Alessandro or his brother Benedetto, where Alessandro originally wrote it. Then Benedetto said, "Hey, I'm gonna rewrite it in a different key or transpose it so it's easier," and this goes back and forth. But what's interesting about the version that we're going to hear is that a violinist of the 20th century, a very, very well-known violinist within the Italian musical world, he was someone who took music and, dare I say, cheese it up. And he would take certain pieces and add a little bit this and here. And this is the version that most oboists play. Yeah. It's definitely not all the original.
And doesn't he actually like quote some of the Bach embellishments?
He does. Completely.
Yeah. So God knows who wrote this thing, actually.
Exactly. And there are some certain things where it's he adds in suspensions with the cellos and this, and you're like, hold on, this is not the original, but it's beautiful and lovely. So it's a combination really of three people. It's Alessandro. He was the main person, but it's accessible enough and easy enough to morph into different things, and it works.
And it's a good example, actually, of how Venetian music made its way to the rest of Europe, because Bach did actually. I mean, and what I find fascinating about it is that, like, hands on it in 1713, and so it's got a unique and wonderful story. And I sort of love, I mean, one of the reasons it became so famous as a solo piano work, Glenn Gould gave one of the early recordings of it in early in his career, and that took off, and then everyone else fell in love with it. Mm-hmm. And like it's such a fascinating story to this weird little piece of music.
And I love how you mentioned the how music traveled at that time, because we talked about Bach being influenced, and Bach never did go. He never went to Italy, but music, did travel very quickly, because they knew all of these works. They knew Marcello. They knew these people, or their works at least. And I mean, Handel and Bach grew up within, spitting distance of each other. They never actually met. But, and so to have someone from Italy or from elsewhere and have this music well known throughout all of Europe and other places as well is pretty exceptional, because we're not talking about getting on a jet and flying, an hour later to be in Germany.
Or sending an email with a PDF.
Yeah, forget
which
the
is
flights.
how we do all new music now.
That's right.
Yeah, you just write the composer and they send it to you.
Yeah.
Actually, that's how you do all music in a pandemic. We used to wait months to have music shipped from Germany, and now they email you back and say, "Here's the PDF."
Yeah. It's so interesting how when there's a a need for it, how quickly it happens. We know that with the main thing that's happening right now.
Exactly.
But yeah.
Principal Aaron Brophy is out front for this beautiful concerto. The second movement, obviously gorgeous. The outer movements, though, are virtuosic, and that is one of those traits of Venetian music. Mm-hmm. They wrote such opulent, ornate, strange, I'm going to use that word again, virtuosity into their music. It was for show.
It's like, we talk about Carnival and Vegas and all that, where you sit down for a meal, and it's going to be an exceptional meal because this restaurant is like crazy. And you get something at the beginning that is like just full and everything. You get your second movement, which is more kind of like you get some ice wine or something, that pairs with a bit of a dessert or whatever. And the third movement is some killer, let's ramp up, let's get some coffee, let's ramp it up because we're going dancing afterwards. That's what I feel a concerto is, where we're one of these Venetian concertos. You've got the spice in there, you've got all these different things, but then you relax for a bit and go, oh, this is gorgeous. And let's keep dancing.
And you can tell they did it for show, for concerts, to entertain the crowds, because of that virtuosity, but because most Venetian music are concertos.
And music, for the most part at the time, was entertainment. It wasn't, of course, Bach and everyone, they had their depth. And of course, the sacred music was there as well. But a lot of the secular music was entertainment. It was to get the crowd, to engage them. And of course, so much of music came after is as well. But I'm saying that Vivaldi writing 500 pieces, it's not like he's deliberating over every bar to write his 9 masterpieces. It's like, okay, we need this, we need this, we need this. We need to entertain this crowd at Carnival. Let's go.
Yeah, there's great writings about him writing his operas for Carnival, and how they were written for the season, for who the Doge's palace knew was coming.
Right.
And so certain stories could be told in certain years and not others, because like his opera Limpiada, which lived and died in one season, because they couldn't do it the following year because of the parties that were coming, the royal parties that were coming. And so Cannes Film Festival of its time, people go to experience the art form and the party.
Yeah.
It's not just go to experience the art form.
And I like how you liken it to a film festival where a lot of that music, opera, etc., was based on the current events. It was all there. They were making fun of this or that. Handel in the whole opera company in London, where John Gay wrote an opera, The Beggar's Opera, that just mocked everything in it, the Italian opera, and it went bankrupt. And so in Venice, it was, like you said, some royalty were bashed this year. There was a big scandal. They'll sneak that in clever ways, but everyone knows exactly what's happening.
Handel's Agrippina was exactly that situation. 1713 premiered as the opening night of Carnival. The Doge wanted that particular work because, of course, Agrippina is the mother of Nero, who brought about the fall of the Roman Empire, and the Doge wanted a little dig, and so Handel wrote this opera that it's fascinating to think of the carnival as we know it, the party that it is today. I mean, when you go to Venice, have you been during the carnival itself?
No, I haven't.
I have not either. It's winter and it's wet. Rains a lot. They get the Acqua Alta. It's not great, but then it really was like one of those big film festivals, like one of those big experiences that maybe we don't have anything quite like today. Where all of the world's entertainment focus was for a period of time. It's a pretty fascinating moment in history, and we're all the more lucky to have all this music from that era.
Exactly.
We had a phenomenal question come in online. If you are joining us on Facebook or on YouTube, you can write in questions. This one was really great. So during the recent cold snap, there was a news clip about sound being different in the cold weather. I can tell you it's not a lot of fun to play in a room that we got it to 20 for sure. It's your fingers get sore, basses come apart, that sort of thing. Given the humidity in Venice, does music generally and instruments does it have an effect on the wood and the sound in Venice?
Great question. Wow. Because it does. This has happened as a string player. I know firsthand how your instrument reacts to it. There's so all of the string instruments are glued together. Very high-end glue, but it's glued together, and they can crack. And if it's too dry or cold, they can crack. But when it's too humid, your strings loosen slightly. Your bow hair, you have to keep tightening it because it gets looser and looser. And this is when we've done recording sessions in the heat of a Toronto, when it's 35, but the humidity is like 100%, whatever it is. You just get weighed down, not only the sweat off your body, but your instrument as well. And there's a real effect to it. And so, yes, I can imagine it'll be a bit colder at that time of February, like you say, but still the humidity is there. And it does wreak havoc. And of course, not just on string players. Think about the oboists. Think about the flute players, the voice. My God, we know how temperature affects voice. And so, yeah, great question. It definitely does have an influence on it.
Yeah, and there's moldy harpsichords from Venice, because once they're too moist and go into a different climate, it's almost impossible to get them dry again, and so they end up molding on the inside. So you do actually that's a thing. Certain cities bring out moldy harpsichords. So one of the other questions: what are some of the ways that soloists make a concerto their own? That's a great question, because you can have the same concerto played by two different people in the same concert, and it's a different experience.
This is kind of the question of all classical music, because we often play the similar works over and over, or different orchestras play them, and they often sound so different from each other. And soloists, I talked a little bit about, talking to Allison about articulation, about phrasing, that sort of thing. That's a big part of it, because your personality and the way you play really informs a lot of that stuff. Of course, when everyone can play the similar phrase, but if an individual feels very, very strongly about something, or they have a certain technique that lends itself easier to certain things, that can come out more in a solo role and is allowable more in a solo role than, say, in a big orchestral setting where you usually want instruments to blend and usually want, a whole section to do a phrase this way. There's, of course, exceptions to those rules. But whereas soloist, you kind of have carte blanche in a way. And you want to match what the orchestra and the conductor is doing. But that's why we have rehearsals beforehand, so that they line up. But sometimes some of the most interesting things, some of the most interesting recordings over history have been, we only know afterwards, the conflict that went into it and how this...
I mean, sometimes we know ahead of time.
Sometimes we know ahead of time.
Bernstein did announce from the stage, this is not how I wanted to play this concerto, but it's what Glenn Gould wants.
That's right. That's right. Which, even to this day, people are arguing about that Brahms concerto. But the great one of Karajan and Rostropovich, with the Dvorak and the Tchaikovsky. Apparently, they were just at heads with it, and they said, "Screw it, let's just play it." And there's some magical things that come out. But soloists definitely have their certain ways of playing it, and you're going to hear on Saturday how Aaron plays certain phrases, how Allison does, how Chelsea sings it, or Dean plays it. They're all going to be very different. They're all different personalities, but also different ways of playing it, how they articulate things, how they think about certain phrasings. And so that's always fascinating. And I love how it's almost back to back where we get a change as an orchestra with them.
Yeah, and it is that intention that each person brings to the piece that brings it their own.
Yeah.
This is a great question. Is there a modern equivalent to a hit-making cultural center like Venice in the 1700s? This is a great question because, of course, we had Venice, we had Vienna, we had London, we had Paris, we had Moscow, we had Berlin.
Yeah. In the classical music world today, some of I'm going to do two examples. You brought up Berlin. Berlin is a great example because, especially after the wall came down in '89, you saw influx of Eastern and Western coming together, and Berlin is such a dynamic city. It always has been, but it really exploded. But because of a lot of new music composers living there, but also, crazily enough, the electronic dance music scene was really kind of headquartered there for many, many years. And that, a lot of the classical music is not influenced by that, but the thinking was. And you can tell it.
Well, and some of the creators.
Yeah,
Gabriel Prokofiev.
That's right.
Maxim Shostakovich.
Jörg Woodman, all those Widman would they, of course, had influences like that. Today in North America, L.A. it depends on the orchestra. Saskatoon, with what we're doing here. And L.A., with the L.A. Phil, they commission and have for a while now commissioned new works season after season. And I think it's really, really wonderful to see because it not only gives new composers a chance to get their works shown, but repeat performances of them, repeat playings of those composers. So it's not just a one-hit wonder, even though we're talking about hit machines. But, this composer did this 2 years ago. Now there's another piece by this composer, plus 10, 15, 20, 30 other composers year after year. And I think that's really, really important, and that's why we do it here, is to give a voice to those composers so that we can share this creativity. We get a chance to play it, which is exciting.
Yeah, and the other place that I think is paramount right now to classical music is Brooklyn.
Yes.
Holy,
yes.
Between, and I think it's hilarious. Like, I think Nico Mooley, Jennifer Higdon, and Caroline Shaw all live within like a 6-block radius of each other.
The hippest place in the U.S.
Yeah, Caroline Shaw walks Nico's dog from time to time, and talks about it on Twitter. I find that fascinating. But Brooklyn is a lot of the same thing. It's a lot of those young, the next generation of composers who couldn't afford to live in Manhattan. So they lived in Brooklyn.
And they're influenced by the surroundings because there's a lot of, Brooklyn is not just known for its classical music, but for everything. It's the home base of the hipster, like that in Austin in the US, where that's where those coffee shops, those beards, all of that, like that's Brooklyn. We think of that. And that definitely influences those composers, or the composers influence the other parts of culture that are growing there.
Yeah. What's your favorite silver lining about creating music under the cloud of COVID-19?
Ooh, nicely put. I think it's the innovation that we've had to examine, and with the orchestra here, the way that we just stepped up and said, let's do this. We're not really sure how we're going to do it, but let's just go, all in and see where it goes. And because of that innovation that has happened this year, this is something that we would have done eventually. We would have gone streaming and done stuff, but now we're doing it. And so come post COVID, this is just another realm. And it's not only about giving access to people that can't come to the hall, but the creative possibilities of streaming new music, where a composer, we can work with them and stream that, and there's so many more possibilities, because once you go through those doors, it opens 4 more. And we couldn't have seen those doors unless we walked through this one. And so that's what I think is really exciting about this, is that, bam, this has opened all of our ways of thinking, our minds to different ways of thinking.
Yeah, and the letting go of habits. Our industry particularly is habitual. We plan typically a year and a half or 2 years in advance, and normally by this time of year we know exactly what we're playing in every concert next year. I actually think that we've been able to adapt in a much more interesting way with not having that kind of habitual practice in place. And I don't just mean us here at the SSO, although it has really changed what we do, but I think the industry itself. I think, looking at these last 10 years in our industry, where we had these superstar performers who would do 120 concerts a year, and we would see them end up injured. We'd see them end up burned out. We'd see them end up no longer performing like they used to. We'd see opera singers who, the opera world in the last 10 years has had more injuries than ever before. And part of that was the speed at which we were exacting all of this habit. And, I often think for those artists who are performing like that, booking a concert with an orchestra 3 years down the road is great. Do we really need to decide the repertoire right now? Could we leave that until closer to that concert day, 2 months ahead of time, 4 weeks ahead of time, as long as the orchestra has it in time to learn? Does it allow us to actually be more inside and alive in our own artistry as an industry? And I think the answer is yes. How we cling to it. There was a great article in I forget which magazine it was in the States, talking about the year that Edward Elgar released one of his symphonies, and in that first year it was performed by 70 orchestras. Now that would not be possible, because even once a successful piece takes the stage at LA Phil, it can take 5 or 6 years before it even gets to the New York Phil.
Exactly, and there's the great point about being in the moment, and let alone having to do that 2 or 3 years in advance, but also what is current, like what is going on in terms of the relevancy of our situation, because that relevancy might not be, it's probably going to be similar within 1 or 2 years, but there's an immediacy when we can relate to what's going on in that moment. And because there are those big changes that happen, big social change or some event that happens, like the summer happened. In the past, we couldn't respond to that. We could respond to it in a small gesture, maybe, or this or that. But because that programming is in place, it's harder to switch. And there are some advantages. Can we? And we can do it. We've done it. We could change within a day a whole program. And soloists,
sometimes literally.
Yes, yes. And they're soloists, their creativity to their life as well.
A sense of immediacy to what we do. Yeah, I think that's a really fascinating way to put it. Thank you for being here. We're back here in April. You're here to do an all Bach concert.
That's
We're
right.
not going to say any more about it quite yet, but that's later in April. And our next concert, I think this is concert 10. We are one of the most active orchestras in Canada this year. Lots of orchestras. I'm very proud of our industry, of how well we adapted and got got musicians hired and working. But I think we are the most active orchestra in Canada. We'll sleep someday. We have a concert in 2 weeks' time that I'm really thrilled. We have again an all Saskatoon lineup with Paul Sukin conducting, and he's done some of the arrangements as well. And Eileen Laverty is joining us, and Kim De La Forest is joining us as a fiddler. And it's a night in Dublin for St. Patrick's Day. That's going to be a lot of fun. We're back here next month on literally a month from tonight with Judith Yan, who will be in town to conduct for a trip across the transatlantic cruise, a trip across the Atlantic with it's a really cool, fun,
It is.
really fun, really brilliant program that actually takes you through the experience of getting on the boat at Southampton and experiencing the waves, the fancy dinners at the captain's table, the ballroom, and then arriving in New York. So yeah, it's lots of fun. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Well, I'm looking forward to spending the week working with you and yeah, just really enjoying this concert. It's a great concert.
Yeah, it's great to be back.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Huge thanks again to everyone at McNally Robinson. We'll see you this weekend with the Carnival of Venice. Thanks.
Thank you.